this video, we'll be looking at Curley, a character from Of Mice and Men, in preparation for your upcoming exam. These are just some ideas. There are lots of things you can say about Curley. If you've looked at my other videos, you know that Steinbeck has created complex characters in this novella. And so there's lots of different things that you can say. These are just some ideas from me. So I would personally focus on his power, because that sets him apart from other characters in the novella. He's the boss's son, so that places him in a really privileged and powerful position. He will one day inherit his father's land, and linked to the last quote I have on here, he won't ever get canned because he is the boss's son. And that again sets him apart from the other workers on the ranch. His position isn't as precarious as theirs. And I think that adds to the anxiety that we feel whenever he is present in the novella, because he can afford to cause trouble, which he does. And he, in many respects, contrasts to George. If you look at George, he repeatedly talks about not getting into trouble. He's always worried about Lenny getting into trouble. And when he meets Curley, he's very worried that he's going to cause trouble. So that really kind of contrasts their position. One man of privilege and the other a typical itinerant worker who knows there aren't many jobs out there, that he needs to do everything he can to keep this one. He also wears high-heeled boots just like his father. This is a symbol of his power, but one might argue that Steinbeck is suggesting actually that his power is artificial. So in contrast to someone like Slim, who is presented as a much more natural leader and doesn't need to wear high-heeled boots to establish his authority over others, Curley needs to, which again just suggests that this doesn't come naturally to him. So if you are doing the Edexcel IGCSE English Literature exam, just a reminder that context is worth 50% of your marks for this question. So it's really important that you don't just add it at the end of your paragraph and talk about it vaguely and kind of repeat the same thing. So the examiner's really looking for detailed understanding of context. So what could you say about Curley in relation to the context? He definitely represents the landowners of the 1930s, and Steinbeck viewed landowners as exploitative of itinerant workers during this time. Remember that unemployment rates were reaching record highs because of the Great Depression and also because of the Dust Bowl. So employers didn't really feel like they needed to treat their workers with dignity or kindness, because they could be so easily replaced. There was such a surplus of workers at this time. And so you might argue that's also the reason why Curley behaves the way he can, because he doesn't really care what happens to these workers. They can be easily replaced. It's also worth mentioning more specifically that in the 1930s, and specifically in Central California, farmers were cutting wages and they were causing workers to live in camps that very much looked like city dumps. And there were workers' demonstrations against this, but they're actually met with brutality. And Steinbeck went to California during this time to see these city dumps himself. And I think this is where he really gained this hatred for large-scale corporate farm interests. And he saw this kind of capitalization of agricultural work as ruining agricultural life. And that might explain why he writes about Slim in such a godlike way, in contrast to Curley. Slim is that archetypal cowboy who is a moral character and much more likeable, whereas Curley is just the spoilt son of a landowner who is cruel and actually quite pathetic, especially the scenes where we see he gets his hand crushed by Lenny. And so what is Steinbeck really trying to say, you might argue, through the character of Curley, is that he believed capitalism as a system placed power into the wrong hands and it disturbed the natural order of things. He's clearly very violent. His head of tightly curled hair, you might argue, symbolises how tightly wound up he is. And that makes him again a liability. We feel uneasy in his presence because he's always looking for a fight. His hands, and again, look at his posture to support that. His hands closed in fists, and he goes into a slight crouch when he meets Lenny and George for the first time, and they haven't even said anything at this point. So it does indicate, his body language indicates that he's ready or even looking for a fight at all times. And so that combative stance really shows that he's extremely defensive. But actually, we'll come back to this later. It might also suggest that he's actually incredibly insecure. The fact that he's always ready for a fight and almost willing to establish, or very keen to establish, his authority over others, and to kind of demonstrate his strength as well. And we'll come back to this idea later on in this presentation of, is this actually a sign that he's incredibly insecure? And then, of course, the greatest sign of his violence is when he attacks Lenny. And if you recall, Lenny's actually daydreaming about the rabbits on the ranch, smiling to himself, not listening to the conversation that's happening at that time. And so really it's completely unprovoked. And look at the violent verbs that are used: slashed, smashed, slugging, swinging. So his assault on Lenny is clearly aggressive. And it's also further emphasised by Lenny's initial non-response, because what that does is it makes us pity Lenny even more, and of course that helps further emphasise that he is a good character who does terrible things, but it also reinforces our hatred for Curley. Steinbeck doesn't want us to like Curley because he's a man in a privileged position exploiting the weak. So we might link this to how his cruelty towards the weakest members of the ranch, in this instance we were looking at his cruelty towards Lenny, draws parallels with the exploitative nature of rich landowners and how cruelly they treated workers. His violence could also symbolise the brutal world created by capitalism. As we've already mentioned, Steinbeck was not a fan of capitalism. He saw it as this highly competitive system that created this need, this desire for power, but once you had it, also almost a fear in losing it, and this obsession with defending that power and maintaining it. And that results in the oppression of the weakest members in society. You've got to keep the weakest members weak to protect your own power. He's also neglectful of his wife. Curley's wife repeatedly says throughout the novella, "I'm looking for Curley," and that reveals how lonely she is. Of course, you can also quote the fact that she says she's lonely to Lenny towards the end of the novella, and also says that he's not a nice guy. It's further supported by the fact that he chooses to go out to old Susie's. Remember, her place is the local bar and the local brothel, rather than be at home with his wife, and they've only been married for 2 weeks, and she's already lonely on the ranch, and he chooses to spend that with men that, by the sounds of it, he doesn't even have a friendship with, really, rather than be with his own wife. So he's clearly very neglectful. And then I think the ultimate sign that he doesn't love his wife is when he sees her dead body. He comes to life. So that juxtaposition of how we'd expect a loving husband to react upon seeing the dead body of their wife really highlights that this is a loveless marriage. He's almost filled with excitement as he rounds up the men to chase down Lenny. So the death of his wife doesn't spark sadness, it sparks revenge and a desire to re-establish his authority. So clearly you can link this to the patriarchal world in which all these characters live in 1930s America. Women were seen as the weaker sex, they were constantly objectified, and Curley's wife's death isn't really viewed as a loss for Curley, but more like an attack on his personal property. and hence why he feels so revengeful. And also this is an opportunity to get back at Lenny, who crushed his hand earlier on in the novella as well. And like I said earlier, does this really all link to the fact that he's actually an incredibly insecure man? He's likened to a terrier just before he attacks Lenny. So that small dog breed is known for their viciousness, and of course that mirrors his violence that we've talked about previously. But it could be argued that actually, like a terrier, that viciousness really stems from the fact that they are of small size and maybe they're incredibly anxious and nervous animals. So rather than it being a fearlessness, maybe it's actually more derived from his fear and anxiety over his small size. This one's an interesting one. He boasts about, rather crudely, that he has this glove on full of Vaseline to keep his hands soft for his wife. But when we look at the relationship we've seen between him and Curley's wife, they're never seen together. He chooses to go to old Susie's bar and brothel rather than spend the evening with his wife. He doesn't sound like someone who cares about pleasing his wife whatsoever. So you have to really think about, why does he say that? Why is he wearing that? And there's a number of theories out there. Here's one of them that I read that I thought was interesting. Could it indicate that he is in fact impotent? In other words, he's incapable of having sex and therefore incapable of pleasing his wife. So he needs to keep his hands soft because he can't use anything else to please her. It could explain why Curley's wife so desperately seeks out other male attention. So it's one way of looking at it. Or could you argue it's got nothing to do with that? It's all bravado, and he's not really keeping his hands soft to please his wife. He just says it to impress the other men, to boast about his sex life. He also has these unfounded suspicions of Curley's wife being with Slim, and that's when Slim really loses it with him. It's just before he attacks Lenny. And that suggests he lacks confidence in his own ability to please his wife as well, and maybe deep down knows that Slim is a more impressive, more likeable character than he is. Think also about the way Slim manipulates him after his hand is crushed. We know that Slim is a very intuitive character. He seems to read characters, or the character of men, really well. He seems to understand Curley's wife just wants a bit of attention, so he's kind to her. He says that he notices Lenny isn't a bad guy, he can tell. So he seems to just read people really well. And in this instance, he reads Curley really well and understands that Curley's greatest insecurity is losing his reputation. So he uses that against him and basically says, look, you could go and tell on Lenny, or you could just say that you got that caught in a machine. And Curley agrees, and surely agreeing to that rather than getting Lenny canned shows that his image matters to him much more than actually getting revenge on Lenny for crushing his hand. So I think this really kind of reflects the pressures on men during the 1930s and this very rigid idea of what a man should be in the 1930s, which was to be strong and to be a provider. Violence was also seen to be a masculine trait. He doesn't have the body type of a typical man, and I use that term very loosely, but you know, that tall, strong type. We already hear numerous times that he's small and he's slim. So does that place him in a position where he feels like he needs to constantly prove his masculinity at every stance because because he doesn't have the body type of a real man? And again, I'm using that term very loosely. Also think about the fact that to have a wife that strayed was also a really bad reflection at that time on the husband, and we see that Carlson mentions that earlier on in the novella and says, something along the lines of, why don't you control your wife and keep her indoors, or something along those lines. And so there's an element of, it's your fault. If your wife plays away, it's your fault. Because you should be able to control her, and it shows a sign of weakness. So maybe Curley doesn't fear his wife having an affair because it would cause him pain, but really he fears looking weak in front of the other men. So again, it all comes back to this insecurity and this really rigid idea of what a man should be. So those are some ideas of how you could explore the character of Curley. Remember, in your essay as a whole, you'll want to think about an overall message that Steinbeck is trying to relay to the reader through creating whatever character, and in this instance it's Curley. So you might want to explore the fact that he is trying to highlight his negative views on capitalism or large-scale farm corporations. So he wants to make sure that we don't like Curley. Is he in some way a commentary on power and the insecurities it creates and the need to oppress others? And that's really very much linked to capitalism as well. And also separate to that is just a commentary on masculinity and the violence it creates, as well as the insecurities that come with it. So those are some ideas. I'm always happy to see students comment and offer their own interpretations, and I advise that you read those comments as well, because they can be really eye-opening and original. So feel free to leave comments.